The morning my son-in-law Barry Holt discovered the inheritance was gone, he stood in my kitchen holding his phone like it had just bitten him. "What do you mean, transferred?" His voice cracked on the last word. "When? To where?" I was sitting at the table with my tea, watching him, 63 years old, and I had never once seen Barry Holt at a loss for words. He was the kind of man who always had an answer ready before you finished asking the question. That Tuesday morning in late October, he had nothing. I already knew why. I had known for several weeks. I simply hadn't decided what to do with that knowledge yet. My name is Meredith Calloway, and for the last 11 years, since my husband passed and I moved into the smaller house on Hawthorne Drive, my family had quietly decided I was someone who needed looking after. I understood it in the beginning. Grief does strange things to people, and watching someone grieve does strange things too. My daughter Sandra and Barry swooped in the way loving families do. They handled the estate paperwork. They managed the sale of the larger house. They sat across from me at the lawyer's office while documents were signed, and they nodded reassuringly whenever I looked uncertain. I wasn't uncertain, as it turned out. I simply didn't want to create tension by asking too many questions. That was my first mistake. The second was trusting that nothing would change. I met Ted Calloway when I was 26 years old at a hardware store in Oakville, Ontario. He was arguing with a clerk about the wrong grade of sandpaper. I was waiting behind him with a cart full of paint supplies and the particular impatience of someone with a project to finish. He turned around to apologize for the wait, saw me, and forgot what he was arguing about entirely. That's what he always said when he told the story anyway. I remembered it slightly differently. I remembered thinking he was a bit dramatic. Then I remembered thinking he had very kind eyes. We married 14 months later. We built a life in Ontario the slow, ordinary way. 2 children, Sandra first, then her brother Michael, who moved to British Columbia in his 30s and called every Sunday without fail. Ted ran a small equipment rental business for most of his working life. Nothing grand, nothing spectacular. But the business was steady, and Ted was careful with money in the way people are when they grew up without much of it. When he died of a heart attack at 68, he left behind a comfortable estate. Not wealthy by any grand measure, but enough. An RRSP, investment accounts, the house, a small portfolio of holdings he had quietly built over 2 decades, consulting with an advisor every year without once mentioning it to Sandra or Barry, or even, much of the time, to me. Ted believed in privacy the way some people believe in religion. He showed me everything 3 months before he died. I didn't know at the time that he was saying goodbye. He sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with his binders and his reading glasses, and he walked me through every account, every document, every contact name. I sat beside him drinking coffee and I listened. Ted was not a man who repeated himself, so when he said something, you paid attention. By the end of that afternoon, I understood our finances better than I had in 40 years of marriage. 2 weeks after the funeral, Barry sat across from me at the same kitchen table and said, "Meredith, don't worry about any of this. I'll handle the details." I let him. That was my third mistake. Barry Holt was not a bad man in the way villains in films are bad. He didn't sneer. He didn't threaten. He was actually quite charming, and he genuinely loved Sandra, at least as far as I could see. What Barry was, more than anything, was ambitious. He had grown up watching other people succeed and spent his whole adult life convinced he deserved the same. He had tried 3 different businesses before settling into commercial real estate. And commercial real estate was doing well enough until the market shifted and several large deals fell through in the same year. I didn't know about the deals falling through. Not then. What I knew was that Barry had been coming around more often, that he'd started bringing folders when he visited, setting them on my kitchen table alongside the coffee cups and asking me to sign things. Authorizations, he called them. Updates to the estate management structure. Routine paperwork. Legal housekeeping. I signed the first few without much thought. The language was dense, and I was still tired from grief, and Barry had a way of explaining things that made hesitation feel like inconvenience rather than good sense. He'd say things like, "It's just for the advisor's records," or "The accountant needs this for year-end." I nodded. I signed. Then my friend Dottie Marsh came to visit one afternoon in February. Dottie and I had worked together at the school board for 22 years. She'd been in administration while I managed the financial records for 3 different schools. Numbers were my background. Not glamorous, not powerful, but real. I had spent 2 decades tracking budgets, auditing invoices, catching errors other people overlooked. When I retired, the comptroller gave a short speech and said I had saved the board more money than she could calculate, mostly by noticing things. I hadn't thought about any of that in years. Dottie sat at my kitchen table eating a lemon square, and she asked casually how I was managing since Ted's passing. I told her Barry had taken over most of the financial matters. She looked at me over her reading glasses with an expression I recognized from our working years. She used to look at expense reports that way. "Is that right?" she said. Not a question, just those 3 words. I changed the subject, but something stayed with me. That evening, I opened the drawer where I kept important documents. Ted's binders were still there. I hadn't touched them since the year before. I opened the first one and began reading. An hour later, I found the number for the investment advisor, whose name Ted had written in careful block letters at the top of the first page. His name was Mr. Fenwick. He answered on the second ring. We spoke for 40 minutes. By the end of the call, I was sitting very still. Several things had changed in the accounts since Ted's passing. That was normal. Estates go through transitions, accounts get restructured. What was not normal, according to Mr. Fenwick, was the nature of some of those changes. He spoke carefully. He chose his words the way people do when they know something important but are uncertain how much you already know. He asked me, at one point, whether I had reviewed the trust amendment filed in my name the previous spring. I hadn't filed any trust amendment. After we ended the call, I sat in my kitchen for a long time without turning on any lights. Outside, the February dark came early the way it does in Ontario, dropping like a curtain around 4 in the afternoon. I watched the light disappear from the backyard. The bird feeder Ted built was still out there, needing seed. I had been meaning to fill it for weeks. I thought about a lot of things that evening. About Ted and his careful binders. About Barry and his folders. About the way I had stopped asking questions somewhere along the way, and when exactly that had happened. Then I picked up the phone and called my son Michael. Michael Calloway was 56 years old and worked as a structural engineer in Kelowna. He was quiet, precise, and slow to judge, all qualities that drove Sandra crazy when they were growing up, and that I found invaluable now. He answered on the 3rd ring, the Sunday call habit breaking on a Thursday evening. "Mum," immediately cautious. "Is everything all right?" I told him it wasn't. I told him what I had learned from Mr. Fenwick. Michael listened without interrupting, which he was very good at. When I finished, there was a brief pause. "How long has Barry been managing the accounts?" "Since the fall after your father died." 11 months, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. "I'm going to fly out next week." I told him he didn't need to. He came anyway, which was exactly what I needed and what I couldn't quite bring myself to ask for. Before Michael arrived, I made an appointment with a lawyer I had found on my own. Not the family lawyer who had handled Ted's estate and whose office shared a floor with Barry's real estate firm. A different lawyer. A woman named Patricia Dunmore who practiced out of a small office in Burlington. A friend from my school board years had used her during a difficult divorce and said Patricia Dunmore was the kind of person who read documents the way a surgeon reads scans. Thoroughly, without sentiment. I gathered everything I could find. The binders Ted had left, the signed authorizations from the past year, statements I had quietly requested from Mr. Fenwick. Property records I found through public databases. Everything in a tote bag, which I carried into Patricia Dunmore's office on a Wednesday morning looking, I imagine, like someone's grandmother coming to dispute a parking ticket. Patricia Dunmore was in her mid-50s, with short silver hair, and the efficient warmth of someone who had heard difficult things for many years without losing the ability to care about them. She reviewed my documents quietly for nearly 20 minutes while I sat across from her and tried not to watch the clock. When she looked up, her expression was composed. But her first question told me everything about how seriously she was taking this. "Mrs. Calloway, are you aware that your name appears as the primary trustee of a family trust registered 8 months ago?" I was not. She placed 3 documents side by side on her desk. My name appeared on each one. Trustee. Signing authority. Authorized transferor. She asked if I had signed anything authorizing the creation of this trust. I had signed things Barry brought me, I said. I didn't know that was one of them. Patricia nodded slowly. Then she said something I hadn't heard in years, but immediately recognized. The language here is quite specific. She meant it wasn't accidental. Someone had been very careful about what they were building, and they had built it in my name. In the weeks that followed, I lived 2 lives, the way I had apparently been living 2 lives for some time, except now I was aware of both. On the surface, I remained Meredith Calloway, Ted's widow, Sandra's mother, grandmother to 2 boys who came for Christmas and left behind apple juice stains on the sofa cushions. I attended book club. I filled the bird feeder. I had Sandra and Barry for dinner on a Sunday in early March and sat across from my son-in-law while he talked about the Toronto real estate market, and I passed him the breadbasket and said almost nothing at all. Barry had always taken my silence as agreement. He still did. Behind that surface, Patricia Dunmore was moving, carefully, methodically, building a picture out of documents. Michael had flown out and stayed for a week, and by the time he left we had given Patricia everything we had, and she had a clearer view than either of us of what we were looking at. What we were looking at was this. Over the course of 11 months, a series of restructuring moves had quietly shifted control of a significant portion of Ted's estate into a trust that Barry effectively managed, though my name appeared on the paperwork. Investment accounts had been partially drawn down. A promissory note had been signed. In my name, by my signature, for a sum I had never agreed to, against a property claim. The money, or much of it, had flowed toward Barry's commercial real estate dealings. Several of those dealings were now in difficulty. Patricia said it plainly during our 3rd meeting. Someone used your identity, your legal standing, and your late husband's assets to manage a financial problem that wasn't yours to manage. I looked out the window of her office at the parking lot below. A sparrow was sitting on a wire above a row of cars. I noticed it the way you notice small things when large things are too much to hold all at once. How much? I asked. She named a figure. It was substantial. Not everything. Ted's careful planning had protected more than Barry likely realized. But it was substantial. Michael, sitting beside me, didn't move. That was how I knew he was upset. My son goes very still when he is upset, the way a house goes quiet before a storm. The question I kept returning to was not about the money. The money was important, but it wasn't the sharpest thing. The sharpest thing was this, Sandra knew. Not everything, I didn't think, and not from the beginning. But somewhere along the way, she had become aware that Barry had restructured things, and she had not said anything to me. Whether she knew the full scale of it, or whether Barry had reassured her, the way he reassured everyone, I couldn't yet say. What I knew was that she had been coming to dinners, asking how I was managing, refilling my teacup with the particular tenderness of someone carrying guilt, and saying nothing. That knowledge sat in my chest like a stone. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Michael wanted to. I understood the impulse, and I asked him to wait. There was a practical reason for waiting. Patricia needed more time to complete the documentation. But there was another reason, one I found harder to explain. I had spent 11 years being someone who didn't ask questions. I had spent 11 months being someone whose name was on documents she'd never read. Before anything else happened, I wanted to understand the full shape of things. So I waited. And while I waited, I watched. What I noticed was small things. Barry checking his phone at dinner more than usual. Sandra deflecting when I mentioned finances, steering conversation elsewhere with a smoothness that felt rehearsed. A tightness around Barry's eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. He was managing something. You could see it in him the way you can see a person carrying something heavy in a crowd, in the way they hold their shoulders. One evening in April, Sandra and I were sitting in my living room after dinner, and Barry had gone to make a call in the car. Sandra poured the last of the tea and looked at the window. Then she said, without quite looking at me, "Barry's working through a complicated situation with a property deal. Just so you know." Just so you know, as if she was preparing me for something, as if she had been waiting for a moment to say that and hadn't quite found the courage to say more. I looked at my daughter for a moment. She was 58 years old, and still had Ted's coloring, the dark eyes, and the particular way she held her head when she was thinking. I had loved her for 58 years without qualification. That didn't change in that moment. But something shifted. Not love, something alongside love, a kind of sadness, and beneath the sadness, a resolve. Is there anything I should know? I asked. She met my eyes. Then she looked away. Barry handles all of that. I nodded. Of course, I said. And I changed the subject. The call came on a Thursday morning in late October, 3 days before Michael was scheduled to fly back to visit. I was in the kitchen making oatmeal when my phone rang. It was Mr. Fenwick, the investment advisor. He spoke quickly, which was not like him. Mrs. Calloway, I need to inform you that a series of transactions was flagged by our compliance department yesterday. The accounts associated with the Calloway Trust have been put under review. He spoke carefully. He said words like irregularities and authorization concerns. He said the review had been triggered internally, but that depending on the findings it might involve regulatory notification. I asked him what that meant, practically. He paused. It means access to those accounts will be restricted while the review is underway. I thanked him and set down my phone. I thought about Barry, who would find out, probably within the hour, that something had changed. I was right about the hour. The knock at my door came at 10:15 in the morning. Barry didn't ring the bell. He knocked, quick and hard, the way people do when they're past the stage of being polite about it. When I opened the door, he was standing on my front step in a jacket that looked like he'd grabbed it without thinking, his phone in his hand, his face a color I'd never seen on him before. "Did you do this?" he said. I stood in the doorway and looked at him. The oak tree at the end of my drive had gone entirely orange overnight. I noticed that. I noticed the cold in the air, the particular sharp smell of October in Ontario that I had loved my whole life. "Do you want to come in?" I said. He came in. He didn't sit down. He moved around my kitchen the way he always moved through rooms he thought of as his, with ownership, with comfort, that hadn't been earned so much as assumed. He set his phone on my counter. He looked at me and said the accounts were under review and he needed to know who had authorized it. I put the kettle on. "Barry," I said, "I think you know what's happening." He stared at me. I recognized that expression. It was the expression of a man who has been certain for a very long time that a particular person was not paying attention. The moment you discover they were. He started explaining. He always had explanations ready. The property deals, the bridge financing, the temporary restructuring. He said everything was meant to be temporary. He said my money was never at risk, not really, that it was more of a holding arrangement. He said Ted would have understood business necessities. That last one was a mistake. I poured the hot water and turned around. "Ted built that portfolio over 30 years, I said. "He showed me exactly what was in it. He wrote it all down, Barry, because he wanted me to be able to protect it after he was gone." I looked at my son-in-law. He didn't leave it for a bridge loan on a commercial property that didn't close. Barry went very quiet. Then, and I'll remember this for the rest of my life, he said, "You don't understand how these things work, Meredith." I had been waiting for those words. Not consciously, but somewhere underneath everything I had learned over the past several months, I had known they were coming. I sat down at my kitchen table. The table where Ted had shown me his binders. The table where Barry had brought his folders. The table where I had signed things I shouldn't have signed because I trusted the wrong person and stopped trusting myself. I folded my hands. "Sit down, please," I said. He sat. I told him I knew about the trust. I told him I knew about the promissory note. I told him I knew about the withdrawals and the property accounts and the routing of funds through structures registered in my name. I told him Patricia Dunmore had spent 8 weeks reviewing every document and that she had a very clear picture of what had been built and how. With each sentence, Barry's expression changed, not dramatically, but steadily, the way light changes at the end of the day. Finally, he said, "Sandra doesn't know the details." I looked at him. "I know," I said. "If this becomes," he stopped, tried again. "Things could get complicated for her." "Things became complicated for me 11 months ago," I said. "I didn't choose that." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said very quietly that he had intended to put it all back, that he'd been certain the deal would close, that it was never meant to go this far. I believed him that it had started with a certainty. I had seen it before. In people who made one decision with full confidence and then kept deciding, quietly, in the same direction. until they were somewhere they would never have chosen to stand at the beginning. But believing someone didn't mean absorbing their consequences. I stood up and picked up my phone. "Patricia Dunmore is expecting a call this morning," I said. "I think you should speak with your own lawyer today." He looked at me for a moment, then he left. He didn't slam the door. That surprised me slightly. He simply went. I stood in my kitchen for a few minutes in the silence. Then I called Dottie Marsh and asked if she wanted to go for a walk. The months that came after that morning were not simple. They never are, I think, when family is involved. The legal process wound forward slowly and carefully, the way legal processes do. Patricia was thorough. The institution's compliance review had already flagged enough that the regulatory question became unavoidable. Barry retained a lawyer. Several accounts remained restricted for a considerable time. The promissory note was contested and eventually voided on the grounds that my signature had been obtained under misrepresentation. The funds that could be recovered were recovered. Not everything, but more than I had initially believed possible. Sandra and I had our hardest conversation in May. She came alone. She sat across from me at this kitchen table, and she cried in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child, openly, without trying to manage it. She told me she hadn't known the full scope of what Barry had done. She told me she'd known something was wrong for several months before the accounts were frozen and had not known how to say so to me. She told me she'd told herself Barry would fix it. That last sentence was the one I recognized. People protect the stories they've built. Sometimes love makes it easier to believe a reassurance than to ask a question. I took my daughter's hand. I didn't tell her everything was all right because it wasn't. I didn't tell her I forgave her immediately, because forgiveness that costs nothing isn't quite honest. What I told her was that I understood how it had happened, and that I wasn't finished being her mother, and that we would have to build something new from where we were standing. She stayed for dinner. We didn't talk about Barry. We talked about her boys, and about a gardens she was thinking of putting in, and about a book I'd recommended that she'd finally gotten around to reading. At one point she laughed at something I said, and for a moment I saw the girl she had been, 20 years ago, sitting at this same table telling me about the man she'd just met named Barry Holt. Life doesn't give you clean endings. It gives you evenings like that one. Michael came in the spring and stayed for 2 weeks. We went through Ted's binders together from beginning to end, just the two of us, at this kitchen table with coffee and reading glasses. It was an odd sort of comfort. Ted had been so careful. The records were meticulous, annotated in his tidy handwriting, every account cross-referenced with a corresponding folder. Reading them felt like hearing from him one more time. Michael is not a man who says much when he's emotional, but at one point he closed a binder, set it carefully on the table, and said, "Dad knew you'd need this." I thought about that for a long time afterward, because Ted did know. He had shown me everything, walked me through every account, written down every name, not because he expected betrayal, but because he understood something important. That the person most responsible for protecting your future is you. He hadn't left me helpless. I had simply stopped believing I was capable of what I'd already proven I could do. That was, in the end, the thing I had to reckon with. Not Barry. Not even the lost funds, though those mattered. The thing I had to reckon with was the 11 years I had quietly agreed to be someone who needed managing. The years of nodding, the years of signing without reading, the careful, slow transfer of authority I had handed over without quite realizing I was handing it over. I came back from all of that slowly. Slowly is the honest sniff word. I started with simple things. I opened my own accounts and managed them myself. I read every statement. I met with Mr. Fenwick quarterly, and I asked every question I had. And he answered them. And when I didn't understand his answer, I said so, and he explained again. He told me once, near the end of a meeting, that I asked very good questions. I told him I used to do this for a living. He looked surprised. That surprised me. Then a woman at my church mentioned that she'd been managing her late husband's affairs since November, and had no idea where to begin. I offered to sit with her one afternoon. Then another woman called, a friend of a friend, recently widowed, who had never managed finances on her own. Then a woman from book club who had recently separated. Then an older neighbor who'd been using a financial product she didn't understand because her nephew had recommended it without explanation. They came to my kitchen table. I made tea. I asked them to bring their documents. I didn't offer advice in the legal sense. I simply read things with them, explained what I could, asked questions alongside them, and told them which questions to bring to the professionals they needed to find. Every single woman in that kitchen said some version of the same thing. She had believed she wasn't capable of understanding, not because she wasn't, because someone had said so long enough and convincingly enough that she had stopped testing it. I know something about that. Barry's situation resolved in the way these things tend to resolve in real life, without drama, without a courtroom scene, without a satisfying moment of public reckoning. There were consequences. Financial ones, professional ones, a reputational damage in the circles he'd operated in that I understand has been significant. He and Sandra separated in the fall. I don't discuss the details because they aren't mine to discuss. What I know is that Sandra is working now, managing a small property on her own, calling me on Sundays, slowly finding her footing. She told me recently that she wished she had said something sooner. I told her I wished I had started asking questions sooner. I think we both meant it. There is a letter Ted wrote that I found tucked inside the back cover of the last binder, behind an envelope labeled simply with my name. I don't know when he wrote it. He never mentioned it. I found it in the month after everything came to light, on a quiet November evening when the lake by my new place had just started icing at the edges. The letter wasn't long. Ted was never one for long letters. He said he knew I was capable of handling things, that he had always known, that the only thing he worried about was whether I would remember that when he wasn't there to say so. He said the numbers were all in order, but that the numbers weren't really the point. The point was that I should trust what I knew. I read it twice. Then I set it on the table beside a cup of cold tea and looked out at the frozen edge of the lake for a long while. I had moved to a smaller place in a quieter town the previous summer. A house with a good kitchen and a window that faced east and a garden that needed work, which suited me. Dottie had helped me move. Michael had driven from Kelowna, which was too far, and I had told him not to but was glad he did. The first morning after I moved, I made coffee and stood at the east-facing window and watched the sun come up over the trees. For the first time in years, I felt something I can only describe as lightness. Not happiness exactly. Not the absence of loss. Just a sense of standing on ground that was actually mine. I still have Ted's binders. I go through them every year, updating what needs updating, removing what no longer applies. I have added sections that didn't exist before. Contacts, legal notes, a record of everything Patricia Dunmore helped me recover and how. I call it a working document, which is what Ted would have called it. At one of the kitchen table sessions last spring, a woman in her late 70s asked me what the most important thing was, the single thing, if she could only remember one thing. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, read everything before you sign it, every word, and if someone discourages you from reading it, that is exactly when you read it most carefully. She wrote it down. I watched her writing, and I thought of Ted, who wrote things down. Because he believed that what you knew could protect you, and of the years I had spent protecting other people and forgetting to protect myself. And of the Thursday morning when a man stood in my kitchen and told me I didn't understand how things worked, and of how wrong he was. The accounts Barry lost access to were the ones registered in my name. The knowledge I had spent a lifetime building, the years of careful work and quiet competence and watching and learning, that was registered somewhere else entirely, somewhere nobody could freeze it and nobody could forge a signature to take it away. And standing in my kitchen on Hawthorne Drive, watching Barry Holt drive away, I felt, for the first time in 11 years, completely certain of who I was.